Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, my topic is Endgames, and I have picked two endgames played by perhaps one of the most prolific endgame players of all times, former world champion Anatoly Karpov. When you look at his games, especially endgames or strategical games, you'll see magic happening in situations where others may agree to a draw, or at least in their minds give up on trying to win. Those are the places that made the difference when he played on, he fought on, and he had ideas to outsmart his opponents. Let's get started with one of those examples when this position was reached in a game he played back in 1982 in a TV game that used to be a tradition for many years in Hamburg, Germany, that players play live on TV. It's being televised, and then it's being shown a number more times later, and there is live commentary. It's really fascinating. Actually, I played myself 3 of those Grandmaster TV games back some years ago. So anyway, this position was reached in the game, and as you can see, there is material balance. All the pawns for both sides are still on the board, and each side has a rook and knight. Looks like kind of a boring endgame, not too much happening. The position is rather closed. Okay, white has a bit more doubled pawns than white, because as you can see there are 4 pawns on the e file, 2 of each color, both sides having a pair of doubled pawns, but white has a second pair of doubled pawns as well on the g file. So obviously that's theoretically somewhat of a disadvantage, although in this case that should not necessarily be the case, because the g4 pawn actually is kind of holding off 2 black pawns right now, and in the future possibly can give white a little waiting move playing g3 with the second g pawn. So reality is that my first impression of this position would be that it's completely equal, and unless white makes mistakes, the game should end in a draw. The interesting part is about this endgame and the next one is, I think, that sometimes when you have these type of equal positions, it's almost like it wouldn't matter which side of the board Karpov would have played on. You never know, he may have won with white as well. So my point is that it's not that the position is that good, but Karpov's technique was that good. So first of all, I'd like you to think and see what you would do if you're playing with the black pieces. What game plan would you choose, and what ideas you may even have at all trying to win this game as black? Well, Karpov came up with a brilliant idea, and in chess basically there are 2 types of situations. One that are very concrete and requires move-by-move calculation, and others when you need to think more in patterns, in ideas, in plans. For example, like where would I like to see my knight? Where would I like to position my king? Or thoughts like that. So in this particular case, Karpov came up with a game plan, and the game plan was to position his knight from c6 to c5. Obviously, that cannot be done in a single move. Black will have to spend 3 moves to accomplish that. Well, in view of that, Black's next move will not be as surprising already. Although it's a type of move I really admire, because it's a paradox. It's quite rare in chess that you would make moves against general principles and they work. Well, with all that introduction, let me continue showing the game where he played knight b8, which is pretty impressive. Normally you say develop your pieces, centralize your pieces, and so on and so on. This is, however, one of those rare exceptions when moving backwards and almost like undeveloping is a good thing. It is a good thing because black aims to get his knight to c5, and you will see very soon why that is a good plan. White's problem was in this example and also in the next one that I don't think realized the danger. They thought they are off the hook. It's only a matter of time that the game will end in a draw, not if it will end in a draw. And White kind of played careless and allowed black's plan to fully flourish. In this position, White played knight to f3, which is certainly not a bad idea. The knight is better positioned on f3 than it would be on h2. And black continued with the game plan by playing knight to d7. So the idea is to get the knight to c5, from where it will target both d3 and e4 pawns. It would target the d3 pawn directly, and the point will be that once the black knight gets to c5, White will have serious difficulty in advancing that d pawn, because the d pawn is having the important role of guarding the e4 pawn. Now also the knight is aiming in two different directions, on one hand to c5 as I mentioned, and on the other hand, depending on how White continues, the knight can appear on f6 as well. So White has to be careful, and that is the reason why White cannot play d4 right here, right now, because then the knight would go the other way, attacking the e4 and g4 pawns simultaneously. So after knight went to d7, White continued here by playing king to g3, probably trying to make sure that the g4 pawn is not in trouble. Although it is recommended not to rush with that move, as White would have time to go to g3 and protect that g4 pawn once the black knight decides which direction it's going, whether it's c5 or f6. And it has been suggested that king g3 was the mistake, and an annotator suggested to play here b3. I'm not clearly understanding what would be the point of that move, but one thing I can think of is that it would prevent a future appearance of black's knight on a4. In other words, White has to be careful because black has multiple ideas going to c5 and a4 or to f6. An idea I would think of here is to play rook to d1 with the idea to get ready to protect the pawn on d3, and then maybe after knight c5 White could play b4 perhaps. In any rate, as you shall see, after king g3 White is getting into trouble. The knight came to c5 and the rook to d1. Things still look quite okay. If black now immediately would play knight a4, White would just play rook d2, protecting everything. And now came the next part of the game plan, and the question is how to further improve black's position. Well, black somehow needs to get his rook in an active position. It is true that the only open file is the f file, but there is nothing much that black can do in the foreseeable future there. Therefore, black came up with an ingenious plan by playing a5 first. As you can see, White is wasting further time, moving the king back and forth, and the rook moved to a6, coming from the side to b6, targeting White's b2 pawn. And here White again had to play b3 to be ready to answer a4 with b4 and to prevent the black knight from coming to a4. After White's next move, White is in real trouble. Knight a4 attacks the pawn on b2. Now the b2 pawn cannot be advanced because then the c3 pawn is hanging. After rook d2, black would just follow up with rook b6, attacking the pawn a second time, and then White is losing a pawn. Or, as in the game, d4, which is an interesting move with the idea that if now knight takes b2, then rook b1, and White would probably win a pawn back on b7 or on e5. But black is not in a rush and rather wants to capture that pawn on b2 with a tempo, with a check, with the rook. After rook b6, White captured on e5 and the rook captured on b2. King f1, and here comes a second pawn, knight c3. And now a lot of pawns are hanging for White, and including the rook as well, but White came up with a tricky move by sacrificing his rook by capturing on d6, with the idea that if now knight takes the rook, then White advances the pawn using the momentum that the black rook is unable to stop the pawn, and then the best black can do is get a draw after knight takes pawn, king e1, knight takes g2, king f1. Now black could repeat moves with knight e3, or after rook b1, if black is trying to win the game and try to get behind the pawn with the rook, then of course the king does not take the knight but moves to e2, stopping that. And now again the best black can do is give perpetual checks. Okay, so black shouldn't capture the rook, and of course Karpov didn't. Simply captured back on d6. Rook took back. Now another important intermediate check, using the momentum that the king cannot go to f2 because then knight takes pawn with a fork. So the knight blocked the check, and now calmly activating the king, protecting the pawn, making sure White is still stuck with the weakness on e4 without losing black's pawn on the e file. The rook returned, protecting the pawn on a2, and now black simply mobilizes where his strength is, on the queen side, advances the pawn, and advances the pawn further. That e4 pawn doesn't run anywhere. King f2, and black goes for the more important pawn with rook a1. And now the game is pretty much over. These were the last couple moves of the game, and here finally White resigned. Pretty impressive game. From a seemingly dead-drawn position, black won pretty quickly. And now let's continue to the next example, which will be similar in that it will involve knights again, but different in that that other piece will be the queen instead of the rook. So here we are, and this position was reached after about 30 moves in the game between the Romanian Grandmaster Georgiu and Anatoly Karpov. And this game was also played in 1982, but in a serious competition in Lucerne at the Olympiad. Again, just like in the previous example, the position looks pretty boring and the game very likely to end in a draw. And obviously, if both sides play well, the game should end in a draw. Well, let's see how Karpov unexpectedly got some life into this boring looking position. As we shall see, Black simply started maneuvering, improving his position, and provoking weaknesses in the opponent's position. Let's see how it got started. King f8, following the principle of centralize your king when it comes to the endgame. Obviously, with most pieces gone from the board, the king can be an active and important participant of endgame play. White played king e2, kind of trying to do the same, and black played king e7. So far things are pretty normal. Now white played queen c2, trying to trade queens, getting closer to a draw. And it's kind of typical that when a lower rated player plays a higher rated player, they oftentimes tend to try to trade pieces, thinking that less pieces, less problems. Well, in this case, while it may be not less problems or more problems, but certainly more challenge, more play in the game if black maintains the queens on the board, even though the position is still not better here for black. Black played queen h5, making sure the queens remain on the board, with the idea to follow up an h4 response with g5 and breaking the symmetry of the pawn structure. White instead played passively with knight f1, so this is certainly the first good sign for black when white needs to retreat. And black continued with king d7, and white played queen c3, trying to target black's pawn on g7, which is protected by the knight now, but it means that it kind of ties the knight down in protecting the pawn. That's why black responded with f6, so the next move the knight can get into the game with knight d6. By the way, the king plays an important role on d7 in stopping the entry points of the white queen along the c file, like on squares like c6 or c8. White continued with h4, also trying to free up the knight so the knight can come back to a more active position. Came knight d6. And now, of course, there is a little tactical threat. The pawn on e4 is hanging because of the pin on the f3 pawn. So white moved out of the pin with king f2 and came knight b5. Queen d3 check, king e7, and knight d3. The knight is back in the game. And the queen did its job, so it comes back to c5. There is a very interesting dynamic in this position, in that to trade queens or not to trade queens, or when to trade queens. We've seen earlier in this endgame that white was offering the exchange of queens and black declined. However, we'll see in the later part of the game that there will be situations when it will be black who is initiating the exchange of the queens. Well, what it basically revolves around is the positioning of the kings. Black would like to trade queens under his conditions in a situation where his king will get an active position in order to attack white's pawns, most likely on the queen side. Right now, it was still the time where it was a good idea for white to initiate this trade again, as the two kings are almost equally close to the battleground. Like, for example, if now black would trade, after white recaptures, very importantly, would keep black's king away from the immediate route to go to d6 and c5, so it would be certainly a good idea for white. White decided on move 40, which in those days typically meant it's the end of the first time control, you typically had to do 40 moves in 2.5 hours in the old days. And this was that critical move 40, which very often time ended up being already short in time. And just to make the time control, White played Queen d2, kind of making a so-called neutral move, just waiting around. Of course, what White needs to deal with is the fact that his knight is pinned, and that's certainly an unpleasant thing. In the meantime, Black played a5, improving his position, and White made yet another waiting move with Queen d3. And Black played knight d4. It's true that now the White knight is not in the pin at the moment, although it still cannot move, because then there would be a discovery by the Black knight. And White made further waiting moves, or perhaps trying to get out of the pin and move the king, while it was better instead again trying to initiate the exchange of the queens. And if Black declines that offer, then try to enter and threaten with checking, or maybe even perpetually checking, the Black king in some cases. White played passively and played King g2. And now, just like in the previous example, a very nice knight maneuver, regrouping the knight to a better location. Knight went back to c6, and again, just like in the last example, we saw that nice knight jump from b8 to d7, remember? And then the knight could go from d7 in the previous example to either f6 or c5. Here also the knight has dual thoughts going to b4 or e5. And this was yet another chance for White to play Queen c4, and that was the best option that White had. White instead played a4, kind of probably not sensing the real danger that is ahead. Came knight e5, attacking the queen and eyeing on the f3 pawn. Queen d2, and now is the moment when things start changing and Black is looking ahead to trade queens. Remember, if now White trades, the Black king takes back, and it's quite visible how much more active and centralized the Black king is to run into c5 and then b4, while the White king is all the way on the king's side. So after Queen d6, White declined the offer to trade and moved the queen to c3, but Black didn't give up on it and played Queen d3, a very strong move, and White is in difficulties. The only way to avoid the exchange of queens would be to start giving checks with Queen c7, but then after King f8, now if Queen takes b6, then Queen e2 check, and then f3 pawns falls and Black gets a very strong attack. Or if White tries to give constant checks, the king simply will run out and away, and after h5 just move the king to h6, and White is in major trouble. So White traded the queens, knight took back, and now we can see the problem, how weak the b3 pawn is. The White king is far too far to defend it, so White can only hope to count on his knight. White played knight c4, going after Black's pawn on b6, and Black goes after White's pawn. Now White captured the pawn on b6. If instead White would retreat and go on defense, it's clear that the Black king would arrive real fast and the king would simply walk in to b4 and White would be in trouble. So White went all out, played knight b6, knight b3. And now again we do see the problem that the Black king is coming in real quick while the White king is far away. For example, if White plays now knight c4, trying to keep the king away, the king simply goes around to e7, And now if king f2, then king c6, king e3, king c5, king d3, king b4, and white will lose that a4 pawn. White tried to confuse things, but it wasn't very helpful. Takes, knight c4, king d7, king f2, king c6. White took the pawn, king d5, knight d3. Now knight c5, offering the knight trades, and of course attacking the pawn on a4 along the way. If now knight b2, then simply king d4, and the black king comes in very quickly. And of course after white gave the pawn up with king e3, knight a4, white's position is quite hopeless. Let me show you the ending moves of the game. Of course black doesn't repeat, gets the knight out of the way of the pawn. And now is ready to push. King d6. And in this position white resigned. It's clear that the black knight is going now after the white pawns, and the white king will be far too far to protect the pawns, and that's why white is in a lost position. Very nice example. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this crazy looking position, both kings are kind of naked in the middle of the board, a lot of pieces hanging around, but nevertheless, if white focuses, white can checkmate black in 3 moves. Have fun and good luck finding the right solution. And the answer is amazing queen sacrifice, followed by an amazing rook sacrifice, and ending with a beautiful cooperation of all 4 minor pieces of white's checkmate, right in the middle of the board. Hope you enjoyed this as much as I did, as well as learned some important endgame skills from the master of endgames, Anatoly Karpov. So long, until next week. Bye-bye.